Thanks for joining me on my IDW Comics Transformers retrospective. Please note that this show is about the first IDW run of Transformers that ran from 2005 to 2018 before they rebooted Transformers a year later. Now, there are so many continuities and universes for the Transformers, and most contain some of the same themes, characters, and even MacGuffins. You have the Cybertronian Civil War, Optimus Prime, Megatron, of course, but then deeper parts of the mythos like the Matrix, Spike, Alpha Trion, and the Autobot Arc, and Unicron. IDW really was not afraid to take risks and take the Transformers in unexpected directions and really dive deep into developing the Transformers mythos. And I'd say for the most part, they did a good job. As with any comic that runs for so many years, sometimes it just becomes hard to keep track of everything, especially when there can be multiple titles going at once, non-linear storytelling with flashbacks, and other events like time travel, parallel universes, and more. I just reread almost the entire line of IDW Transformer comics, and there were still many times I got confused about what was happening to certain characters when they'd show up again. About halfway through the comic run, I stopped getting individual floppies and switched to trades. It was easier to keep a storyline straight with one read-through. However, once you had 2 or 3 series running together, if there was crossover material, sometimes that can really screw with you. Unlike many Transformers storylines, there was no crash landing on Earth. Instead, Earth was simply one of many front lines in the Autobot-Decepticon Civil War. Cybertron was now a wasteland, and the war had spread beyond just their homeworld. This story was started in the first series subtitled Infiltration. Following that, we have Stormbringer, which takes place on Cybertron. Then we head back to Earth for Escalation and Devastation. During this time, they also released a series of one-shots called Spotlights, which focused on different characters. Some of these have no bearing on the main storyline, while others feature important moments. I find this annoying, as if it's important, then it should be in the main title, not on a one-off issue that may slip through the cracks. Following these was a series Maximum Dinobots, and then we have Megatron Origins, which is the earliest series in the timeline, and really works to make Megatron more than just a one-dimensional villain. If you're a Megatron fan, this is a must-read. Next we got a larger scale series called All Hail Megatron, that takes place sometime after the Decepticons conquered Earth. At this time, they also released additional Spotlight issues. After that, we go back to simply calling it Transformers. During this time, we have a few other character-focused 4-issue limited series released, including the introduction of an all-new character named Drift. After several volumes, IDW split the Transformers into 2 separate ongoing series subtitled Robots in Disguise, and More Than Meets the Eye. Now, the first one takes place on Cybertron, and Optimus Prime has supposedly died at this point, which any Transformer fan will tell you is just something you know will happen, and yet is rarely, if ever, permanent. The war is basically ended, and it's now a matter of trying to figure out how Autobots and Decepticons will get along. Add to that, we find there were many Cybertronians who never took sides in the war and simply left the planet. Well, they're coming home now as well, and don't want to have to deal with either faction, who they blame for millions of years' worth of strife. Meanwhile, in More Than Meets the Eye, Hot Rod, now known as Rodimus, captains the ship the Lost Light with a crew of Autobots and Decepticons to go in search of the legendary Knights of Cybertron. We then get one of those big, epic, universe in peril crossover stories with Dark Cybertron. You can pretty much bet that any time there is a major event like this in the IDW universe, Shockwave is somehow involved. We're also given 3 series taking place before the war, titled Autocracy, Monstrosity, and Primacy. Now, I haven't read any of them because of the artist. To say the art is poor would be giving it too much credit. This artist also occasionally worked on the main series, often during big event stories, and he's got a very distinct style. Bad enough you can hardly tell one character from another, and usually so dark you can't even tell what's going on. I'll leave it there. We also get the introduction of another brand new character, Windblade, who IDW invested a ton of time and energy into. She had a couple limited series of her own as well. Robots in Disguise then drops the subtitle in favor of just being called The Transformers. We get two more big event stories with Combiner Wars and Titan's Return, which seem more or less a direction from Hasbro to promote those toy line promotions at the time. After this, things really go off the rails. Another title is introduced called Till All Are One, and More Than Meets the Eye gets retitled as Lost Light. Are you confused yet? If not, sit down for the next part. So Hasbro wants its own comic universe, with all of its properties, and they immediately start enough crossovers to make your head explode. ROM, Mask, G.I. Joe, Action Man, Micronauts, and although they didn't have a title of their own, Visionaries. And while we're at it, let's retitle The Transformers as Optimus Prime. To end it all, we finally get the biggest, baddest Transformers villain ever, Unicron, who doesn't just play a part in the Transformers story, but affects all the other properties as well. So that's just a brief overview of the basic IDW Transformers timeline of releases. Next, I'll explain what was great, not so great, and more. I hope you're enjoying this video. If you want to support Sporkman Studios, there's no better way than to go to getspork.com and find out where you can buy Sporkman comics, t-shirts, and other merchandise. Now back to the Transformers. So let me go into the overall mythology here. Like many 80s era properties, Transformers kept to a simple formula. Good guys were good, bad guys were bad, and the bad guys want to conquer whomever just because that's what bad guys do. IDW added many more shades of gray. The war doesn't just start because one day Megatron wakes up and decides, hey, let's start a war. Before the war, the elite of Cybertron had been corrupt for a long time, and they had a caste system society based around your alt mode, and what those in charge felt you were meant to do. If you turned into a microscope, well, you weren't allowed to be anything but a scientist. Megatron actually didn't want violence, and the reason he and his followers were called Decepticons was because of their slogan, motto, what have you, that was, "You are being deceived." They'd actually write this message as graffiti. In other words, they weren't being deceiving themselves, but wanted the general population to know that their rulers were deceiving them. At this time, Optimus Prime was known as Orion Pax. He was basically a cop, stuck in this corrupt system. In fact, he considered Megatron to be a good person with legitimate grievances. But eventually, Megatron began to believe that violence was the only solution left to them, and war broke out. Now, IDW goes far back at points long before the war. You have a whole pantheon of primes before Optimus, and many of them were not heroic. Some were even straight-up villains. The title Prime had a lot of historical baggage with it, and that really plays a major role in the later storylines. IDW was not afraid to kill off major characters. Some, like Prime of course, often return at some point, but there were also many who didn't. One that stands out was part of a combiner team and was killed before that team ever combined. Initially, RC was the only Transformer featured who was female. Now, why robots would even have genders is the obvious question, but they had an interesting backstory for this. RC had been prisoner of an evil Cybertronian scientist named G-Axis, who was experimenting on her and introducing the concept of gender into Cybertronians. An interesting concept which was kind of abandoned as later on they introduced Windblade and an entire colony of female Transformers. Side note, if the name G-Axis sounds familiar, he was somewhat recycled from the short-lived Marvel's Transformers Generation 2 series. As I mentioned, things in the IDW universe were not always so black and white. You had some Autobots who turned traitor or did horrible things because they thought they were necessary. In some cases, you had Decepticons who joined with Autobots because they felt the Decepticons were no longer following their intended mission. One character that encompassed this shade of gray was Prowl. Prowl was so Machiavellian in this series that you wanted him taken out just as much, if not more so, than the Decepticons. Now, you want to talk about risks? How about Megatron becoming an Autobot? And if you follow his character arc, it actually works. So I feel that almost everything was solid up until Transformers was split between the two titles. There was good writing, interesting and unique ideas, and mostly good art. One thing that was interesting that IDW decided to do moving forward was to have an end to the war. If the storylines all revolve around winning, well, that can be a bit boring. But what happens when war is over? What happens when the guy you were fighting for millions of years is your next-door neighbor? Do you continue to mistrust each other? Or do you realize you had more in common than you thought and become allies? And will war ever stop feeling like it could begin again at any time? Since the titles split, I still looked forward to seeing what was happening with Rodimus and the crew of the Lost Light in More Than Meets the Eye, which was later retitled Lost Light. I liked the characters, and it could be laugh-out-loud funny. A lot. That's not to say it didn't have serious moments, but it was just a fun read. And they really had some crazy out-there adventures, the type of stuff you'd see in Star Trek. That may sound weird, but if you read it, you'd get what I mean. Some really mind-bending situations. And it also introduced the Decepticon Justice Division. Under their leader, Tarn, the DJD hunts down other Decepticons who are considered traitors to the cause. Now, keep in mind, this takes place after the war has ended. But that's not going to stop them. And that's not the only enemy they face. Overlord is just plain scary. Also, standout characters for me were Whirl, Chrome Dome, Rewind, Ultra Magnus, and Brainstorm. However, as far as robots in disguise went, even on a second read-through, it was a real drag at times to get through. There's some good stuff with Prowl and what he's up to, but Bumblebee is kind of in charge of the Autobots at this point. He's just not a great character to have in that role. And eventually Starscream becomes leader of Cybertron. And nothing against the Screamer, but he's the type of character best used in small doses. There's also a non-affiliated character, Metalhawk, who he was just always annoying and a horrible character design. Eventually, Windblade plays a big role, and while there's nothing wrong with Windblade, I just don't find her as interesting as apparently IDW did. So, Robots in Disguise just didn't hold my interest as much. The longer the entire series went on, the more confusing things became. Between the constant retitling, title crossovers, and especially introducing the larger Hasbro universe, there were many times I found myself feeling like I was missing something. Was there a one-shot I didn't know about that would fill in the blanks? Or maybe it was an editing problem? I know sometimes they would refer to something like, that attack almost destroyed the city. And I'd wondered if the characters lived through the same event that I read about, because certainly didn't feel that big a deal from my point of view. I found many times where something happened, but I didn't feel like it was properly conveyed to the reader, or at least to me. Some of this might come down to how I read them in trade paperback form, where a story may be lumped together, but chronologically, you'd need to flip between 2 or 3 different titled trade paperbacks to read it properly. Well, I just don't think that's the best way to write. A big issue I had was with how Optimus Prime was portrayed in the Optimus Prime title. Now, Prime is my favorite character, and while I have no problem with heroes having flaws, they really took it too far in my opinion. Prime was constantly getting shit on, even by his friends. Seems like he was constantly being torn down. I'm looking at you, Pyra Magna. Not only that, but he annexes Earth. Now, he wanted to bring Earth under an umbrella of protection by bringing them under this Council of Worlds as a Cybertronian colony, But for someone whose motto is freedom is the right of all sentient beings, does annexing a freaking planet seem in character? By the time the Unicron story took place, I was just waiting for it to be over. And how did they take out Unicron in the end? Well, I don't want to go into convoluted details, but let's just say... that's the power of love! Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like I really didn't like the IDW run, but that's actually not the case. They did some amazing stuff, made some bold choices, and gave us a much deeper mythos than ever. Seriously, there's a lot that I could probably do deep dives on individually. I do, however, feel that there was a turn at some point where things started going downhill for me. If you're a hardcore Transformers fan and want stories that are more than just rock'em sock'em robots, then definitely check it out. My recommends would be to start with Megatron Origin. It takes place earlier than most everything else, so you'd be starting chronologically for the most part. Then go with order of release. If you get to where the split between More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise, if there's one you don't care for, well then skip that title and just read the other one. So, there you go. Hope you enjoyed this look back at the first Transformers IDW Comics series. Please remember to like and subscribe. If there's two things that suck, it's monopolies and censorship. If you agree, then please support this channel on Rumble. I'm Eric from Sporkman Studios, and it's time to roll out.